Absolutely nobody came out of July's massacres unscathed. Between precipitous political fallout, popular upheaval, and a vicious reactionary backlash, no Parisian, no politician, nor any political club could escape the blast zone. Moderates had long feared such a day as the Champ de Mars would come, a day when the rising tide of radicalism threatened to capsize their ship of state. Slow and steady was the name of the game. Revolution done in increments, and focused narrowly on the political. Thus, in order to preserve the constitutional order, Bailly's Commune and Lafayette's Guard had brought the hammer down on the sans-culottes. It was now believed that this nascent Republican movement had been crushed right off the bat. Radical leaders were scattered, and the sans-culottes reminded who wore the pants around here. Seemingly the intellectuals, the lawyers, the professionals, this bourgeois middle class, were the real winners in all of this. With the Constitution nearing completion, and all 2 years' worth of liberal, rational, and enlightened law properly codified, their political revolution seemed to have been a runaway success. And yes, in spite of this success, the political revolution had failed in one absolutely vital area. It had failed to properly address much, if any, of the actual material grievances of the common people. It was not high-minded ideals or abstract theories on property and politics which had turned the peasants into revolutionaries. Their needs were not political. Their needs were socio-economic. Bread, housing, jobs, wages, basic necessities which fed into the larger social question, a question whose answer scared those in power. Just as keenly as the conservatives, the monarchists, and counter-revolutionaries, the moderates were fearful of what damage might be inflicted upon them and theirs by a social revolution. So far, the moderates had contained the social revolution by appeasing the people with political concessions, which is not unlike trying to fight a grease fire with water, and the massacre at the Champ de Mars was the result. Things had come to a head, where the moderates were threatened by the answer to the social question, and so resorted to violence and repression. Having brought the hammer down, the moderates had definitively proven that the two great strains of revolution, the populist and the institutional, the radical and the liberal, the social and the political, were now no longer compatible. They were, rather, at irreconcilable odds. From this point onwards, the two would diverge. But the moderates weren't quite done yet. As before, during the lead-up to the massacre at the Champ de Mars, the triumvirate of Antoine Barnave, Adrien Duport, and Alexandre Delamette would take a leading role at the helm of the moderate faction. Their rise to prominence within the moderate faction was helped by the faltering careers of several other leading moderates. Lafayette was disgraced, Bailly was out of office, Mayor Pétion was despised by the people, and Mirabeau had died. Having kept relatively low profiles, the triumvirs avoided the worst of public backlash against the National Assembly. And with critical administrative positions, they were largely inoculated against political backstabbing. By now we know pretty well who the triumvirs are, but just what did the triumvirs want? Well, it's pretty simple. Lameth and Duport were archetypal liberal nobles, up there with Lafayette in that regard, who were genuine adherents to the tenets of the August Decrees. Barnave was less liberally inclined, but still very much an enlightened thinker, whose personal fondness for the royal family, and in particular the Queen, made him a staunch opponent of any encroachment upon the monarchy. Altogether, their general goal ran parallel to that of the moderate faction at large. Preserve the monarchy at all costs, rationalise and reform government, keep voting rights in the hands of landed nobles and intelligentsia, and keep a lid on the social revolution. So, to that end, the triumvirs founded a new political club, the Feuillants, named after the church of the Feuillants where they were headquartered. The club was a decidedly conservative entity, which espoused stability and order above all. Its official aims were to protect the monarchy, combat the rising tide of republicanism, and bring prosperity to the ailing kingdom. Unofficially, its goals were like those of the moderates at large: restrict the franchise, protect middle and upper class rights and properties, and keep the masses working. Naturally, therefore, members were typically centre or centre-right noblemen that gravitated towards the triumvirs and their brand of conciliatory conservatism. It was this broadly agreeable message of compromise and stability that mended fences and built bridges, resulting in the full conjoining of the centre and right of the National Assembly set in motion in September. With Mirabeau and so many of the founding members of the Friends of 1789 gone, the Feuillants snatched up most of their membership. For most, the Feuillants were the only attractive alternative to the radical Jacobins. For their tangential role in inciting the rising of the mob at the Champ de Mars, alliance with the Courtier Club, and adoption of a republican mantle, the Jacobin Club once again began to hemorrhage moderate and monarchist members. At one of the club's thrice-weekly meetings, several delegates stormed out in protest. And where else would these delegates go but to their like-minded peers in the newly founded Feuillant Club? These ex-Jacobins proved their loyalty to the Feuillants by inducing several of the regional Jacobin clubs to fly a new flag. By late July and into August, the Feuillants Club began to flex its political muscle. Breaking through the quagmire within the National Assembly and the Paris Commune, it was hardly difficult for the Triumvirs to enact a slew of laws aimed at undermining the left and the sans-culottes. Now, inciting sedition, arson or rioting carried the same penalties as the crime itself. If found guilty, the accused could spend decades in prison. Political clubs had to register with the police to be legally recognised, and obviously, only conscionable, moderate monarchist factions made the cut. Ancien regime-style censorship was reinstated in full, and the leftist press functionally outlawed as libel laws were massively extended. As the election season of mid-August approached, the Triumvirs organised as shrewd a bit of politicking as you've ever seen. They drastically reduced the minimum requirements for property for a potential delegate, meaning functionally anybody with even some property could run for public office. But this was not a populist olive branch. To ensure that common people never actually made it into office, the Triumvirs simultaneously raised the minimum property requirements for electors, ensuring that these electors would only ever vote in Conservatives. The result of this, frankly, very clever move was to make sure that August's elections were heavily skewed in favour of the Feuillants, whilst outwardly, the elections appeared to be free and fair. So as expected, the Feuillants secured all the most prestigious and influential positions. Their overwhelming electoral victory coincided with yet more good news. Years of work by the Constitutional Committee at an end, the time had now come to unveil the Constitution. Centre stage was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The Constitution guaranteed these rights and liberties for all French citizens. After the Declaration came 210 articles that did a few interesting things. The active-passive distinction was codified, the judicial system was overhauled, democratised and made uniform across the departments, royal prerogatives were thoroughly embedded in the Constitution, and edits made by the Triumvirs ensured Louis would keep his veto, as well as be able to hire and fire ministers, diplomats and army officers at will, as well as preside over matters of foreign policy. Moreover, the royal family's annual allowance would be significantly increased, despite the fact that the treasury was already looking concerningly empty. As a grave concern for the Jacobins, the civil constitution of the clergy was omitted from the final text, partly to appease conservative clergymen, but also to allow it to be repealed later without requiring an amendment to the Constitution. And most important of all, the Constitution would abolish the National Assembly. The unicameral system would be maintained, and a single house called the Legislative Assembly would be established, functioning as the sole legislative branch. Really just a National Assembly 2.0. The finished constitution was presented to Louis on September 3rd for his approval. Having been promised a reinstatement of royal powers, and let's be honest, absolutely no recourse but to consent, Louis gave his royal approval. With the go-ahead secured, the committee made a few minor amendments and touch-ups just in time for the grand reveal, scheduled for September 30th. But before the National Assembly retired for the year, and indeed for the last time ever, the Triumvirs made one last power grab. Easily passed was a law that political clubs were no longer recognised. Not technically illegal, but certainly no longer a protected species, and certainly no longer able to expect complaints, proposals, or God forbid petitions, to be legally admissible. The move was intended to specifically undercut the Jacobins and deliver them a final fatal blow. After July and August's onslaught of repressive laws and vicious counterblows, the conservative reaction seemed to have come full circle and put the political left on the ropes. Absolutely, the tangled mess of liberals, radicals, and more recently Republicans were demoralised and scattered. But this defeat was just that, a defeat. Despite having been thrashed about and all but silenced as a voice in government, the Jacobins and their allies had withdrawn to lick their wounds and prepare an inevitable counter-assault. And with the Legislative Assembly, their chance for revenge had arrived. But before all that, it's worth holding a little candlelit in memoriam and reflect on the passing of our dearly departed National Assembly. Depending on your opinion, to see the National Assembly go is either a cause for celebration or fond remembrance. You'd be right to think either way. What the Legislative Assembly had accomplished over its short but incredibly tumultuous lifetime is nothing short of astonishing. Beginning on a tennis court in Paris, the National Assembly was predicated on a promise to never separate until France had a constitution. And it happened. 2 years and 4 months later, but it happened. A capstone to the political revolution. In getting to this high water mark, the Assembly had achieved a whole lot more besides. On the economic front, they had demercantilized the French economy, instituting free trade and free markets. Laissez-faire capitalism, though still early on in its development, was replacing feudalism as the dominant mode of production. This, of course, only elevated the general prosperity of a fairly narrow sliver of the middle class, but was nonetheless a major milestone in European economic development. With the death of feudalism came the death of aristocracy and all that entailed: hereditary office, positions and titles, exclusive rights, and illegal exemptions, a full levelling of the playing field. Looking to the judiciary and the legal system, the Assembly had reformed and homogenised a badly dysfunctional system. With equality before the law and the rights of man clearly defined, the days of arbitrary or disproportionate punishment were largely over. Church and state had been clearly delineated, a process that was ongoing, obviously, and would cause a lot of problems down the line, but was nonetheless a momentous step in the right direction, towards secularism and away from sectarianism. Following on from that, with the civil constitution of the clergy, the Gallic Church had been largely reined in, their centuries-long de facto independence at an end. Enlightenment theories had rationalised all aspects of governance. Meritocracy, offices awarded to the most capable, not necessarily the highest born or the highest bidder. Uniformity, uniform taxation, legal codes, weights and measures, and administrative hierarchies. And rationality, policies determined by committees, by professionals, by a process of deliberation, where ideally the bad is cut and the good retained. In the Assembly, we also have the basis of modern representative government. Now, absolutely, the Assembly wouldn't pass by today's standards, but judged in its temporal context of European absolutism and closed aristocratic political institutions, the Assembly is a hopeful early ray of light for democracy. Another entire aspect of the National Assembly's undertakings I have failed to mention is their sustained efforts to abolish slavery in the kingdom's colonies. Now, I have not mentioned any of this basically at all because I intend to do it justice as its own topic, but it suffices to say that the abolitionist movement was quite strong. Even among many of the Assembly's more centrist elements, there was a broad consensus around abolishing slavery by increments. That is to say, extending the rights of man to encompass slaves and then gradually demolishing the institution. None of this went unopposed, obviously, but the liberal ethos of the political revolution didn't make a distinction between black or white. The distinction was between master and slave, and to men immersed in the liberalism of the Enlightenment, this state of being was profoundly unjust. Just as surely as the serfs of France had been emancipated, so too many activists hoped would the slaves of Martinique or Haiti. Of course, this was a slow, ongoing, and sometimes spasmodic process, but just know that it was going on. On the topic of things I haven't mentioned, but intend to pass out into its own topic, we have the Assembly's fostering of arts and sciences and their elevation of the influence exerted by women. The elevation of women, to be sure, was not policy, but rather a byproduct of general political liberalisation wrought by the Assembly. This liberalisation eroded the bounds of traditional gender roles, creating space for women to assert themselves more freely. Across France, but chiefly in the cities, women were assuming their rightful place alongside men, even in spite of severe traditionalist backlash. Further afield, we have successes in administrative reorganisation and tax reform. Tax reform is particularly noteworthy, especially when we consider that the political revolution basically began over the Crown's inability to pass tax reform by an intractable nobility. That the National Assembly had just swooped in and cleared house, issuing a wealth tax and eliminating tax exemptions, well, it's pretty remarkable. And then we have the Constitution itself, a document that represents the first such document not only in French history, but in European history. And if there's one thing you take away from a glance at the French Revolution, it's just how profound the fallout was from constitutionalism. Never again would a French government be able to rule without this base level of consent. The general will could not be ignored. Now, I really don't want it to seem like we ought to fawn over the National Assembly. It was deeply flawed and barely functional. Every single win I mentioned, every single one, was marred by a nasty combination of compromise, oversight, incompetence, or moderation. But worst of all were the contradictions. A universal declaration for the rights of man that excluded slaves. The eradication of nobility by blood only for a quasi-nobility of property and capital to take their place. Democracy, political enfranchisement, and voting rights, but only for a few 100,000, and to the full exclusion of women. And everywhere, things came in fits and starts. The Assembly's successes achieved in spite of itself, and even then only because of the efforts of a small subset of the most ardent, revolutionary delegates. On one hand were the liberal nobles, with the money and the inclination to push their agenda. The best example is probably Lafayette, who was the primary catalyst for the drafting and eventual adoption of the rights of man. On the other hand were the radical liberals, the ones like Mirabeau, who day by day led from the front, constantly pushing, constantly debating, constantly agitating. Conversely, the bulk of delegates were happy to follow the tide. This speaks to the more general three-way political divide that hurt the Assembly. Between liberals who wanted to follow through on the aims of the revolution, conservatives who wanted to thwart those aims, and moderates who wanted to temper those aims. All, at various stages, were the most powerful and most influential group within the Assembly, getting their way for a while, but never for long. Always vulnerable to the unforeseen consequences of revolutionary episodes, and undermined by altering power dynamics within the Assembly, no group could hope to push their conflicting agendas through to absolute completion, until at long last the moderates seemed to have won out, the bulk of Assembly politics settling in the middle. And what about those incredible figures who have loomed so large in the story of the revolution so far? Lafayette, Mirabeau, Mounier, Barnave, Sieyès, Talleyrand, Grégoire, Bailly, Lameth, Barnave, Duport, Orléans, and so many more. It's sad to think that these men started their journey in the Assembly as our heroes, liberal nobles, enlightened clergymen, or bourgeois liberals. As the good guys, fighting the good fight against the Ancien regime, but who stayed in the game long enough to become villains. When the revolutionary train got going and blood was spilled, is it perhaps natural that they at least wanted to pump the brakes? Or even stop the whole thing entirely? Our figures started out on roughly the same side, with roughly the same goals, but pretty quickly fell prey to factionalism and infighting. And what had they achieved, really? The abolition of the Ancien regime and all of its injustices and excesses, yes, but only to replace it with another regime of different injustices and different excesses. They obviously aren't equally as bad, but they are comparable. Life for the average French citizen was not materially much better. The true beneficiaries of the revolution thus far had been the bourgeois middle class, the intelligentsia, and those liberal nobles who deftly slotted into the constitutional order. As said, the mass of Assembly politics had settled firmly in the centre, and hadn't budged in spite of massive upsets, the flight to Varennes, and then the subsequent massacre at the Champ de Mars. This drift from revolutionary enthusiasm into entrenched conservatism is perhaps indicative of a more salient criticism of the National Assembly, that it was never, ever going to live up to the promises they made to the people. For an institution that declared itself into existence on the notion that they could answer the political question, was it not also presumptuous for them to also so deliberately capitalise upon the energy, mass and momentum of the more popular social revolution? To string the people along for 2 years, with not much more than symbolism or political theatre to offer in place of actual policies intended to fix the woes that ailed the people. The Assembly was purpose-built to answer the political question, but had absolutely no capacity to answer the social question. And yet, there they were all the same. Pandora's box had been opened. The question had been asked. And the Assembly wouldn't, or couldn't, provide an answer. Unpopular, bloated, and hopelessly out of touch, the National Assembly died of natural causes in Paris on September 30th. Their final act was to ratify an unpopular new constitution. The Legislative Assembly picked up the torch. Convened the next day on October 1st in the Hall of the Manège, they resumed more or less where the National Assembly had left off, and would do pretty much the same thing day to day. But whilst its functions were practically identical, the delegates of the Legislative Assembly bore faint resemblance to their forebears. This is because of a little law that was passed way back in May, after having been first proposed by Robespierre. The self-denial law was either a stroke of incredible political genius by Robespierre, or it was merely intended as a symbolic concession forced upon the France of 1789. Either way, what it meant was that none of the current National Assembly delegates could run for re-election. Thus, the path was paved for a new crop of younger, more radical delegates to lead the country, 732 in total. Though a few former nobles slipped through the cracks, the former Third Estate was overwhelmingly represented. Middle-class men of letters, educated, erudite, and most importantly, enlightened. Having won their regional elections, these guys had come from all across France in the last few months and earned their Enlightenment credentials in the political clubs and salons of Paris, discussing and debating politics, economics, religion, ethics, philosophy, science, you name it. But these guys didn't deal exclusively in rhetorical affairs. They were trained and capable administrators, bureaucrats, lawyers, clerks, officers, scientists, academics, and judges who served in municipal government, in the departmental bureaucracies, even in the army or the National Guard. Whenever a decree or law was passed by the National Assembly, it was these middle-class workers who actually did the hard work of transforming abstract and often nebulous law into concrete, actionable policy. And they did this all throughout France, in every one of the 83 departments. So they had invaluable field experience to complement their well-rounded knowledge on all matters theoretical. For them, the revolution was not something ethereal and intangible, it was lived experience. Already then, they were quite unlike their National Assembly forebears. And all of this is to say nothing of the fact that these guys were all seasoned political animals, having successfully navigated all the pitfalls of treacherous regional politics, every bit as racy as Paris politics. When compared to the National Assembly's delegates, many of whom began their political careers on a tennis court in 1789, the incoming delegates possessed sharpened political instincts. And now, it was their time in the sun. From the very outset, the Legislative Assembly was going to go its own way. But though the National Assembly was gone, its factions were not. For the most part, the conservative backbone that sought to counter the revolution at every turn had died with the Assembly. The Augustinians, as prime example, simply faded away, failing to reform for the Legislative Assembly. Incoming delegates were, almost to a man, either sympathetic to or outspoken supporters of the revolution. As many incoming delegates were well provided for under the constitutional order, they naturally gravitated towards the Feuillants. Initially, the club gained the support of a plurality of delegates. This victory was guaranteed by the electors. Feuillants dominated the electorship for the Legislative Assembly, and so naturally conferred delegate status upon men whom they either knew to be politically reliable or who they thought could be persuaded to join their side. There was another good reason for the Feuillants' success. Because unofficial and unrecognised political clubs were functionally illegal, the delegates could not very well form their own, and so slot it into pre-existing clubs, of which the Feuillants Club was the largest. So even though out of power, the triumvirate was still pulling the strings of French politics, just this time from behind a curtain. I'll take this opportunity to introduce a leading light moderate. One among several delegates drawn from the Gironde, Marguerite-Élie Gourdet was a lawyer and a judge. Though he was nominally a Jacobin Club member, Gourdet was a staunch constitutional monarchist and found ready cause with the Feuillants. That being said, he was more on the constitutional side of constitutional monarchist, and wanted the king to accept the Constitution of 1791 without modification. Indeed, Gourdet might be considered one of the foremost defenders of the Constitution, railing against threats posed by rabid Republicans and populist demagogues. Membership in the Jacobin Club spiked as well. After defections to the Feuillants, the Jacobin Club were sorely lacking for members and support. The arrival of hundreds of potential members was a godsend, and 150 joined up, attracted by the club's radical brand of revolutionary politics. Delegates who joined were of a particular type and particular mind. Energetic firebrands, most of these guys knew each other, having been members of the original Jacobin clubs, and so had a head start in organisation, coordination and networking. As the Paris Commune and the National Assembly descended deeper into reactionary conservatism, these loud-mouthed and hot-headed delegates had made a name for themselves viciously decrying both from their departmental perches. Thus they had a strong base of support out in the provinces, having promised their constituents that they would carry forth the revolution from within the heart of government. That brand of vocal, derisive haranguing was visible for all to see in the Jacobin Club's nightly meetings. The best, most eloquent, most energetic speakers in all of politics were now Jacobins, and they all had a revolution on the heart and in the mind. The influx of new members included some people worth mentioning. We have Thomas Augustin de Gasparin, an infantry officer who had the unique distinction of being both of Corsican descent and a Protestant, exactly the kind of minority who was benefited by the revolution. His opinion as an officer was highly regarded, and Gasparin had written a short but influential pamphlet justifying mutiny within the army against poor conditions and corrupt officers. Next up, Georges Couthon, a delegate representing Auvergne and one of the Assembly's most talented orators. Couthon was, you guessed it, a lawyer, and was one of those Jacobin-aligned independents. Worth noting is that though Couthon was paralysed from the waist down, he was still a highly respected delegate, and would go on to have quite the involvement in events down the track. Yet another lawyer and judge to add to our list was Maurice Jean Hérol de Seychelles, elected as a delegate for Paris. Now, a bit like Couthon, Seychelles won't have much of an impact in the Legislative Assembly, but he will be important later on. Another person I'll introduce is the Marquis de Condorcet, making his debut in French politics as a representative for Paris. Condorcet was an archetypal Enlightenment polymath. He was a scientist, a mathematician, political theorist, philosopher and essayist. Already, we felt Condorcet's influence on the course of revolutionary events. Along with Brissot, he was a co-founder of Les Républicains, and a great popularizer of republicanism itself. This might have been Condorcet's great talent, popularizing radical ideas. He wrote and spoke in support of anti-clericalism, abolitionism, democracy, and gender equality. And finally, we have Pierre-Joseph Cambon. Having failed to be elected a delegate for the Third Estate way back in the Estates General, Cambon was undeterred. Returning home to Montpellier, he joined the local administration as a partisan Jacobin, whilst also setting up the local chapter of the Jacobin Club. Cambon was one of the first Jacobins to convert to republicanism, and like most radicals, was very critical of the Assembly's monarchines when they rallied to the king's aid after the flight to Varennes. With such erstwhile allies and members as these, the Jacobins were set to have an interesting time. But things didn't pop straight away. Feuillants, through sheer mass and by their insurmountable influence, managed to forestall so much as the faintest whiff of revolutionary legislation. Each and every major Jacobin proposal was dead on arrival. Additionally, many Feuillants were successfully admitted into sensitive and influential positions within the royal ministry. This was the beginning of the so-called Feuillant ministry, and in day-to-day affairs, Louis was guided and counselled by partisan agents of the club. To further cement their hold on power, the Feuillants steered the Legislative Assembly towards a more bellicose policy towards groups who could seriously undermine the constitutional order. The first target was disloyal priests, those non-juring clergymen who had refused to abide by the civil constitution of the clergy, but who continued to preach and minister. Refractory priests, as they were called, were technically practicing religion illegally, but could get away with it because no one really cared enough to stop them, and also because they were invariably very popular with their congregations. Previously, the National Assembly had tried to mend this divide between themselves and the refractory priests by allowing them to minister in disused churches and paying them a minor stipend for their work. But this policy of leniency had failed. Using their unsupervised, remote platforms, refractory priests expertly played to the religious fears of the peasants and claimed that support for the government was support for heretics and godless apostates. Superstitious rural peasants, already furious at how their beloved parish priests had been forced to bow low before the assembly, eagerly lapped up the vitriolic rhetoric of dejected clergymen. It was primarily out in the Vendée, a predominantly rural region in the west of France, that these holdouts resided. A report delivered in the first week of the Legislative Assembly's deliberations detailed mass resistance to the constitutional order emanating from the Vendée, aided and abetted, if not outright organised by, refractory priests. A full-blown schism between church and state was brewing, and this open wound would continue to fester until treated. Émigré nobles who had fled in their thousands throughout the Revolution were another persistent thorn in the side. From their positions in the courts of neighbouring kingdoms, the émigrés were either of two minds: wait and see what happens in France, or make something happen in France. As we have seen, many of the noblesse de cour, elite even among the aristocracy, were most given to intervention and provocation within the kingdom. After all, they had the most to gain and the most to lose. Inactivity wouldn't restore their fortunes. And yet, years of plotting hadn't resulted in their desired Bourbon restoration. After a few abortive monarchist uprisings in the south, the closest they had come was the king's flight to Varennes, which had ended in failure. Like nothing else, the flight had opened up the eyes of the government to the threat posed by scheming émigrés. As the Feuillants took power, they instituted a policy of rapprochement with the émigrés. Amnesties were offered and confiscated properties reimbursed. Louis didn't need any convincing to pitch in. On October 15th and October 20th, he implored the émigrés to return to France with impassioned pleas. Jacobins didn't like the sound of any sort of rapprochement with the émigrés. They were right to suspect that not only would the Feuillants' policies not work, but they would trigger popular backlash. Furthermore, many delegates to the Legislative Assembly had been drawn from Provence and the Occitan, regions in which the Comte de Provence and other émigrés had orchestrated a brief but bloody monarchist revolt. They'd witnessed firsthand the destruction wrought. The National Assembly's leniency had failed, and the Feuillants were making the same mistake. So it was in an effort to preserve the gains of the revolution that the Jacobins pushed for a harder line. And the man to mark this line in the sand was Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Having evaded the worst of the Feuillants' crackdowns on radicals, Brissot had emerged head held high, elected as a delegate for Paris. Suffering the abuses of imprisonment and exile at the hands of the monarchy, he had a well-warranted disdain for those nobles who were fleeing the country, and viewed them as an immediate and very credible threat to the constitutional order. It's no surprise then that he opened up his career in the Legislative Assembly with an inflammatory address, deliberately intended to force a conclusion to the question of the émigrés. Brissot purported that the nobles who fled the country could only do so either with the assistance of, or at the behest of, an international conspiracy of émigré aristocrats. And even now in exile, they plotted and politicked and schemed for the reinstallation of the Ancien regime. The Comte d'Artois and the Comte de Provence aimed bullish declamations at the constitution, likening it to a yoke around the king's throat. More than merely attack émigrés, Brissot highlighted their links to foreign powers, chiefly the Archduchy of Austria and the Kingdom of Prussia. It was an open secret that both were readying their armies for war in the West, owing to the whispered incitements of the émigrés and the Queen. Brissot's controversial claims would have been met with immediate consternation by the now defunct National Assembly, what with its core of former nobles and those sympathetic to them. But among the more radical, more revolutionary, and a more energetic Legislative Assembly, Brissot's address went down a treat, even among many trepidant Feuillants. He ended with a call to arms, quite literally, against those states who would harbour enemies of the revolution. Noble property should be seized by the state, and preparations should be made for war. After Brissot's explosive entrance into the political limelight, the stage was set for a total reversal of the National Assembly's policy of leniency. If the carrot hadn't worked, here was the stick. By October's end, the Feuillants and Jacobins aligned, and issued an ultimatum to the Comte de Provence. On failing to return to France, the Comte's properties would be seized, his inheritance forfeit, and it would be removed from the line of succession. This ultimatum was the blueprint for a law Cambon drafted a little while later, on November 9th, which stated that all émigrés had 2 months to return to France or otherwise be branded an enemy of the state and a traitor. Written into the language of this law was a threat of a neck-snapping death penalty upon failure to return. But when it came time to gain the final seal of approval for the law, the Legislative Assembly hit a brick wall. Louis withheld his royal approval and instead issued his still legal suspensive veto. For obvious reasons, it was unconscionable for the king to begin to support a measure that would quite literally guarantee the deaths of loyal aristocrats, especially as allies and members of his own family would be among those branded as traitors. Even though his harsh measures had largely fallen through, Brissot had shown that he was the rising star of the Jacobin Club, and it was on his coattails that the club as a whole began to rise to preeminence within the Legislative Assembly. As November continued, the Feuillants began to falter, giving way to the Jacobins. Displacing the Feuillants Club didn't happen merely because of Brissot's brilliance, however. The Feuillants as an institution had severe and fundamental flaws, problems which were detrimental to their long-term survivability. The main issue faced by the club was cultural. They were the club of government, of the status quo. Already at the top, there was little impetus for progress coming from within. Combine this with the club's decentralised model, and inaction set in early on, much to the dismay of the triumvirs. It was Antoine Bonave, in particular, who had high hopes for the Feuillants. When the club was founded, he believed that the royal family would be chuffed to have an overtly monarchist political club dominate French politics and the upper echelons of government. Bonave's high hopes were dashed when the royal family didn't take to the Feuillants at all. The Queen dismissed them as feckless ingrates, and out of office, ineligible for re-election, their influence dwindling, the triumvirs were forced to watch on in horror as their club began to disintegrate throughout November. In short order, the Feuillants ministry followed, ministers resigned or defecting one by one. This precipitous and very public fall from power didn't pass the Jacobins by. Feuillants defectors joined the club in droves. Though far from finished, the Feuillants Club was now in terminal decline. And as the Feuillants take a dive, the stage is once again set for another of the revolution's major course corrections. Already, in their first month, the Legislative Assembly had demonstrated an independent streak, dropping the carrot for the stick. Lenient laws had been replaced with punitive measures, and as the Jacobins gained strength, this trend was set to continue. With both refractory priests and émigrés set squarely in the Assembly's sights, they had come into conflict with the king. Having deployed his suspensive veto, Louis might have spared his aristocratic allegiance the whip for now, but the forces of his ultimate undoing had been set in irresistible motion. Tension in the air, storm clouds on the horizon, all-out war is near at hand.